Greetings, everyone. Here are the main points of the video. Major turmoil at the Kremlin as Putin is caught off guard, and the Chechen leader declares war on NATO. Ukraine threatens to make Russia's rear a new hotspot. Even while on vacation, there's no escape. Ukrainian UAVs level the FSB's lair by the seaside. It's a nightmare for the enemy, as Ukraine establishes its own combat zone right in the heart of enemy territory. Welcome to Luan Banqiansu's analysis program. Before we get into the details, please take a few seconds to like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue. Thank you, dear audience. Major Kremlin developments. Putin is surprised and Chechnya's leader publicly declares war on NATO. Ladies and gentlemen, the Kremlin is witnessing deep cracks as the internal balance of power in the Russian Federation shows signs of slipping beyond President Vladimir Putin's control. The peak of this instability erupted when Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen Republic, publicly called on Moscow to launch a direct military conflict against the countries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. This belligerent statement, as analyzed by the expert known by the alias Superop Socket Vashtran, is not just a simple act of aggression, but also signals an alarming extremism among Russia's elite leadership. Kadyrov affirmed his readiness to deploy Chechen infantry units and special forces to any designated battlefield. At the same time, he directed firepower straight at Western countries because they have provided weapons and intelligence to Ukraine. The fact that a local leader assumes the right to ignite a global conflict reflects a serious decline in Russia's centralized governance system. It has turned the Kremlin's strategic planning process into a chaotic mess. The threatening statements of the Chechen leader are actually just a classic political performance aimed at strengthening his status as an indispensable strongman within the national security apparatus. The central government's increasing reliance on local paramilitary forces has given Kadyrov privileges far beyond those of a provincial governor. As a result, the state is forced to follow an extremist agenda. This information blackmail appears to be an obvious ploy to mislead public opinion and divert attention from the terrible losses and humiliating defeats suffered by the Russian army on the Ukrainian battlefield. By escalating tensions to the level of a life-or-death confrontation with the entire NATO bloc, Kadyrov is trying to shift responsibility for a prolonged and deadlocked war, using the pretext of the risk of world war to cover up his own failures. That recklessness doesn't just stop at words, but is putting Russia's own security in extreme danger. Provocative actions targeting nuclear powers could ignite an uncontrollable escalation spiral, when the government, eager to appease the aggression of local elites, is gradually losing its monopoly over foreign policy. Calls to attack sovereign countries in Western Europe are evidence of a complete ignorance of the actual balance of military power and of the catastrophic cost of a global war. Western institutions have openly warned that any attempt to turn these threats into reality will be met with a swift and severe response from NATO. Such a scenario would certainly lead to the complete collapse of the Russian state system. This military storm has left deep scars and caused the deterioration of the ruling system, where instead of professional diplomacy, populist rhetoric and cries for war have become the tools shaping policy, turning the Kremlin into a debtor of the very extremist system they created. That fervent propaganda once again confirms the current Russian leadership's zero ability to negotiate, making them the main source of instability across the entire Eurasian continent. The true nature of today's fervent statements becomes even more exposed when we look back at the actions of the destructive forces in the early stages of the campaign. Right after the bitter failure of the attack on the capital Kyiv, it was Kadyrov himself who hurriedly ordered his units to withdraw from the Ukrainian battlefield. Despite heavy pressure from the Russian Ministry of Defense and the National Guard, few people know that even before the full-scale military campaign began, the Chechen forces had already been signaled and expected a swift victory in Kyiv. The initial plan was to quickly capture Hostomel airport, creating a foothold for the Russian National Guard to enter the Ukrainian capital and take control of key administrative agencies. However, the Ukrainian army crushed this plot. The Chechen National Guard convoys were ambushed and came under heavy fire right on their way to Hostomel. This created a wave of panic and chaos within the Kadyrovite forces, causing the commanders to later blame and accuse each other of fleeing the battlefield. After the disaster at Hostomel, the Chechen units received new orders to shift their focus and join the fierce assault on the city of Mariupol. This turning point ignited a fierce conflict between Kadyrov and the senior security leadership of the Russian Federation. Exclusive sources from Novaya Gazeta Europe report that, due to the crisis, Kadyrov unilaterally ordered all Chechen forces to withdraw to their homeland. Immediately, the head of the Russian National Guard, Viktor Zolotov, made an urgent call, threatening to charge the Chechen commanders with desertion if they did not turn their convoy around. The tense phone confrontation ended with an extremely harsh and reckless reaction from the Chechen leader. Kadyrov bluntly declared to the head of Rosgvardia that the person giving orders to the Chechens has never been Zolotov or Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, but only Kadyrov himself. Russia's rear is turning into a second inferno. The war in Ukraine is entering a new, painful, and devastating phase for Russia, as Kiev's long-range strikes are gradually turning the vast Russian hinterland into a real second front. The New Yorker magazine commented that if, over the past 4 years, the Ukrainian people have had to bravely endure fierce destruction targeting their cities, their energy networks, and civilian infrastructure, now it is the Russians themselves who, for the first time, are experiencing this devastating shock right on their own homeland. A military source from Moscow itself had to bitterly admit that its vast geographical expanse, once a historical pride of Russia, considered an endless strategic depth capable of swallowing any invading army and a safe place to build weapons factories and infrastructure, has now turned into a critical weakness. The vast territory is no longer a protective shield, but has become an enormous burden, making defense efforts extremely desperate. The current conflict is unfolding simultaneously on two completely separate fronts. One front is on the ground, where fierce fighting continues in the Donbass region, and Russian offensives have slowed down significantly. The other is a blazing front in the skies over both countries, where the scale of thousands of drones, their strike range, and their ability to overwhelm air defense systems have become decisive factors. The Kremlin's logic of war has been completely upended, as countless oil refineries and production facilities have been struck. Military airfields, substations, railways, seaports, and industrial centers located hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from the front lines are all within range. Ukrainian military analyst Mikhail Peskov points out a harsh reality. No matter how modern Russia's air defense network is, it is completely powerless when it has to be stretched out to cover such a vast geographical area. Moscow's predicament becomes even more ironic as Ukraine makes remarkable progress in its defense industry. According to revelations from The New Yorker, if throughout 2024 Ukraine's Firepoint company could only produce just over 2,000 FP-1 drones, now it takes them only about 10 days to roll out an equivalent amount of equipment, not to mention the appearance of the powerful FP-5 Flamingo cruise missile line. The Kremlin seems to have bet on strategic assets, as Western sanctions are strangling Russia's ability to expand advanced weapons production. Moscow has poured billions of dollars into developing Iranian-designed UAV variants and Iskander ballistic missiles. These weapons help them rain bombs down on Ukraine, but are completely useless when it comes to protecting their own rear skies. Expert Nikolai Mashokin from the University of Bremen, Germany, stated on Al Jazeera that Russia is falling into the trap of a passive retaliatory war. The latest missile barrages raining down on Ukrainian cities, including the capital Kiev, have taken countless lives. It is only the exhausted fury of an empire struggling in a whirlwind of war that has completely spun out of its control. Even while on vacation, they couldn't escape as Ukrainian UAVs leveled an FSB hideout by the seaside. Russia's intelligence and control network is suffering painful blows right in the places they thought were the safest. In the coastal area of the occupied Kherson province, a luxurious resort that had been turned into a secret command center for Russia's FSB security agency became the target of a precise and daring raid. Under the coordination of the Ampha Special Operations Center of Ukraine's SBU security agency, 13 drones tore through the sky, heading straight for this stronghold. Despite strict security systems with technical barriers, fortified underground bunkers, armed patrol forces, and more than 70 military vehicles on standby, the airstrike turned the command base into a raging sea of fire. It is estimated that about 100 officers and senior personnel of the FSB were gathered here when disaster struck, dealing a devastating blow to Moscow's war command apparatus in the southern region. The importance of the FSB in this conflict is undeniable, as it serves as the eyes and iron fist of the Kremlin, responsible for counterintelligence, internal control, sabotage prevention, and even recruiting sleeper networks to carry out assassinations and acts of terror behind enemy lines. The destruction of this coordination center not only caused heavy losses among key personnel, but also seriously disrupted the enemy's chain of command, forcing Russia to disperse its forces to secure its own critical facilities, which in turn made logistics and supply for their stationed troops more chaotic than ever. The battle in Kherson was not a single event, but rather a link in a large-scale, multi-pronged combat campaign led by the SBU and Ukraine's defense intelligence. The Ukrainian unmanned systems forces and regular army were deployed simultaneously. The cover of night was no longer safe for the Russian army, as everyday groups of UAVs persistently hunted and destroyed command posts, air defense positions and logistics hubs, from the occupied territories to deep within Russian territory. A vivid demonstration of this far-reaching power was the destruction of the Tu-95 strategic bomber right at the Engels Air Base, the incineration of 3 major oil depots in the Stavropol region, or the sea drone attacks hitting Russian Shadow Fleet oil tankers in the Black Sea. In particular, the blow struck at the vital logistics line across the Kerch Strait has exposed the deep vulnerability of the Russian war machine. As confirmed by Robert Brobdy, also known as Maria, the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, the strategic Kerch ferry line has been almost completely destroyed after coordinated joint operations. Previously, the transport lifeline connecting Kapkak Port and Kimport depended on 4 large ferries operating continuously, along with one in reserve at Goyport. However, in just the first 2 weeks of July, the situation changed dramatically when most of these ferries were destroyed or severely damaged, cutting off the main supply artery of the Russian garrison forces. A nightmare for Moscow, Ukraine set up a combat zone deep in enemy territory. Under increasing pressure from Kiev's drone squadrons, the Russian air defense network seemed to be rendered helpless. Over the Black Sea, the constant presence of Ukrainian forces has forced the Russian Air Force to maintain continuous aerial patrols in response. Meanwhile, in the Sea of Azov area, even without maintaining surface fleets, Ukraine still has complete control over the airspace above. Ukrainian Navy spokesperson Dmitry Patenchuk analyzed that after a long period of enduring overwhelming firepower, it is now the Russian military that is experiencing the suffocating anxiety and extreme insecurity they once imposed on their opponents. The persistent and precise attacks targeting the logistics system not only isolate the Crimean Peninsula, but also directly strike the Russian army group entrenched on the left bank of the Dnipro River in the Kherson region. On this fiercely contested front, ensuring a steady supply of military provisions for the garrison forces has become a persistent challenge for the Russian commanders. Because both main supply routes leading to Kherson are at similar distances and are simultaneously subjected to intense fire, supplying this outpost has become an extremely dangerous and complicated task. The long-term strategy that Ukraine is implementing for Crimea is to turn the peninsula into a suitcase without a handle stuffed with bricks for the Kremlin, a draining burden that puts Russia in a deadlock, whether they hold on to it or abandon it. For Moscow, Crimea and the Sevastopol naval base are not just strategic fortresses in the Black Sea, but also military outposts that help them maintain their position and project power into the Mediterranean region. However, Crimea's fatal weakness lies in its natural geography, a strip of land surrounded on 3 sides by water, making it extremely costly to defend and maintain logistics. Looking back through history, whenever Crimea's lifeline was cut off, the outcome was always the same, and history now seems ready to repeat itself once again. So with the latest developments and analysis, who do you think currently holds the upper hand? Russia or Ukraine? And what will Putin do when the leader of Chechnya openly calls for war with NATO?